Hi, Dr. Ferguson. Uh,
Morning.
Morning. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to talk about your methodology. I wonder if I can ask you to start by introducing yourself and introducing your EdD research.
Yep, sure. I'm a central academic in the social work part of Wales and the Open University, but that's very recent since I completed my doctorate. And I've kind of come very much from practice in social work and in social work education in the field in terms of workplace learning, which was really the focus of my research study. I kind of really wanted to explore what happens for social workers learning through doing the daily job. And that's really been what the focus of my study has been about, exploring the lived experience of social workers learning through their work.
Thank you. I know you had an absolutely fantastic title for your thesis. Can you tell us what it is?
Um, yes, it was actually called When David Bowie Created Ziggy Stardust, the lived experience of social workers learning through work. And that really came from a striking metaphor that one of the social workers used to describe that experience. So it came very much from that voice of the social workers. But yeah, I really like it now that it's there. Actually, I always prefer to get a Hawkwind reference into my research kind of work, but actually I didn't this time, so it's David Bowie.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks very much. So perhaps I can start by asking, is there a particular research question that drove your study?
There was, and it was really, and I had to keep coming back to that research question right throughout, and I think that really helped me keep a cohesive kind of approach with what I did. And it was really about what is it like to be a social worker learning through doing a piece of work or a job of work that you can't really describe very easily. So it was that real focus about what is it like to learn as a social worker through doing work. And that kind of is really at the heart, at the core of everything about everything else I did, really, kind of coming back to that. It didn't start off as being that as my research question. It started off being something around improving workplace learning for social workers. But when I kind of really refined that, it became this, what is it actually like? Because I didn't think we understood that well enough to then look at exploring it. I hope that makes sense.
That does make sense. Thank you very much. So can I ask you about your research methods and your research methodology?
Yeah, well, I chose to use, after quite a long time, to use interpretative phenomenological analysis. I'm really quite interested in phenomenology. I wasn't so much, or I didn't realise I was so much interested in this at the outset of doing the doctorate programme, but I kind of selected that because I felt it had a really, really good connection with what I was trying to find out. So I did really focus on what's the best way to kind of get the right sort of data to help me answer that fundamental question that I kind of had got to. So this kind of methodology really helps me focus, or help me focus on this notion of lived experience, drawing and trying to kind of get some really good, thick, rich description of people's lived experiences, a real commitment to individual experience, as well as looking at what might happen across a group of participants, but really focusing on that unique and individual lived experience. Because if I was doing research that was looking at people that were using social work services, or somebody's experience of maybe a health condition or something, I'd want to really hear from lived experience. So I kind of thought, well, actually, why would I not really be wanting to hear that from social workers if they are the people that I'm wanting to speak to in this study? So I chose IPA, and I chose to use individual interviews, and I focused very, very strongly on the detail of every aspect of those interviews. I also did follow-up interviews to really look at, I did a transcript after the first interview, and I gave that to all the participants that had shared their experiences with me before I then did a follow-up. So basically the follow-up interview was just really sensing what was their take on the words they'd used in the first interview, all very connected, and trying to really have me not imposing my sense making on their sense making, which is part of IPA, but trying to really hear them making sense as they look at their own words in the second interview. So it sounds very complex, really. I suppose maybe I'm sounding a bit confused as I describe it, but the methods that I used were very connected to the overarching methodology and very, very connected to exploring this absolute detail of the lived experience, and also then that bit about trying to make a bit of sense of that, which is part of IPA as opposed to other phenomenological approaches. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, Az.
It does make sense, but let me repeat it back to you to make sure I've understood what you said
Yeah,
properly. So your interview, your research method is an interview, and you used more than one interview.
I
You
did.
you interviewed, transcript, and then got your participants to check the interview and to check that they had said what they wanted to say.
Well, I wasn't using the second interview to check that they'd said what they wanted to say. I used it to try and help them elicit how they made sense of what they'd said, because the transcript was absolutely verbatim. So from that respect, I wasn't necessarily checking what they'd said, but I wanted to hear from them. If that sort of triggered them to make a bit of sense of their own lived experience. I did give the opportunity to add anything additional that they wanted to, but more so it was just really about showing them their words. And it was almost therapeutic really in how that worked, in terms of them sort of learning about themselves as they looked at their own words, and then were able to kind of add some sort of perspectives about that. So kind of it was a little bit of a twist around that, which really worked well for me, as.
Thank you. So just to make sure that I've got that, with the second interview, they're looking at the transcript and they're looking at the meaning of some of the things that they have said and trying to make sense of the things that they've said. And that second interview is based around having a discussion of that first interview. And if you
Absolutely.
like, their interpretation of what they said the first time around.
Yeah, that's said much
Okay.
more succinctly than me. So.
Well, that's how I understand what you said. So
Yes.
that's brilliant. Thank you. And in terms of connecting that to IPA, it's a process of people making sense of their experience, making sense of their phenomena.
Yes.
Elaborate on that bit of it again for me. Connect
Yeah.
it to your methodology.
Yeah, so you can get really sort of tied up in knots with the methodology, but I think to be really, really committed to IPA, which I really tried to be, you're not just looking at getting description of lived experience. You are, I mean, there are other obviously interpretive approaches in phenomenology as well, and this one is really around describing, but also the participants making sense of their experiences, and then the researcher making sense of the participants' sense making. So there are these different elements of IPA, and I think that they can be done to varying degrees, well or otherwise, and I kind of really try to hold firm to these different aspects of the approach, and tie it all together, kind of trying to tie it all together in a sort of visual diagram for myself about how it related to the research question and how I had stayed committed. And certainly in my thesis, I kind of looked at in a lot of detail about the very different aspects that I'd used or explored through all the different parts of the design of the interviews to do this, and then the way that I had managed to analyse the work through all the different detail of this, because I think you've got to really structure that and almost kind of, you know, you've really got to be very immersed in all the different parts of that. So.
Okay, thank you. So can you then discuss alignment between the research question, your epistemology, so how you go about answering that question, your methodology, the thinking that sits behind the methods that you've used, and your actual methods? Can you just talk about how you thought about and ensured that alignment?
Yes, well, I think because I really wanted to get right at the heart of the structure and texture of lived experience, that's how I was trying to understand what I meant by lived experience. I wanted to not just think about what that means on a kind of surface level about how how we might describe something that happens to us or something. I wanted to really understand how that felt, the sensory experience of that, the sights, sounds, smells, the detail of what we live. You know, any experience that we live has all these different parts to it, and I learned a lot about that through doing the research. You know, there's some really great work from a man called Max van Manen that looks at life world existential. So he talks a lot about how we live in relation to the places that we're in, how we live in relation to things, how we live in relation to relationships with others, how we live, you know, all this stuff around how we learn through the body and how we experience the world through the body. So these things began to influence me a lot more. So I was really looking at trying to get, and I designed my interviews around trying to get description that would include these aspects of lived experience. So I felt that the approach that I then chose, provided I designed the interviews to really elicit the detail in that way. They were very open questions, but they were structured to try and be prompted and get that really, really deep description. I think that's why there was a really good fit from trying to, what I was wanting to explore, and then using this approach. But I did think that it really would hinge, and it did hinge on the design of those questions to get that, and my confidence in being able to get that kind of description, which I think was really helped by having a practice background in doing, you know, quite deep sort of maybe emotional work with people. That's what I think gave me confidence to hold that kind of emotion that I got in the description and try and elicit that description in the first place. So yeah, so quite a process, quite an immersive process, as I say, but I think very aligned. I think I couldn't have used anything other than phenomenology if I wanted to get data of this type. Whereas originally I'd obviously thought about using all sorts of things to study workplace learning, but actually when I got to that issue of lived experience, I thought, actually, how can I really get that without using phenomenology? So that's kind of, I do think things stayed very aligned, but I kept having to check, and I think you mentioned about being conscious of what I was doing. I checked all the time, and I got lost on the way a lot of times, and I would come back to look at descriptions of how you ought to do this kind of method, you know, this kind of methodology, these kind of methods, thought about other methods too, thought about using you know, photographs, artwork, these sorts of things, but I wanted to look at the language that was used, so it was really important to use the interviews for me as well. So I was always checking about the alignment, and I felt I almost had, I'm kind of using my hands almost like things fitted together very much, and it was a diagram using sort of circles that I had visually, and I kind of had everything in the middle of it all connected and swirling round, but fundamentally all connected together. So yeah, I hope that makes a wee bit of sense too.
It does make sense. Thank you. I mean, there are actually two questions that I want to ask, and one is I think you said something about checking that you were doing it properly, if you like, and I wonder how sort of closely you felt you followed the you know, the orthodoxy of this approach, or whether there was any scope within what you did for innovation or creation. That's just, yeah, let's start with that. How did that go?
I still think about this a lot, because I think that IPA, you know, the abbreviation of this approach, it's a relatively new approach, but it's becoming very, very common to use. And I think, like many other approaches, you can do it well, or I think you could do it on a surface level. So I think it was really important to me, because I felt there could be challenges to using this approach. As you know, why would this be the best thing to use? I thought, okay, I'm going to be really strong on why I think this is good for me, and that's probably why I tried to be as rigorous in how that's described. But I mean, it's a contested, you know, it's contested whether there are differences across all sorts of different phenomenological approaches. These things are, you know, a huge arena of scholarly debate, really, about, you know, what is the difference between, you know, heuristic, you know, other approaches that are looking at this interpretation and the making of meaning and the sense making. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to answer the question about all the differences all of the time and think about that. I think, okay, I'm going to justify why I think this makes sense to me, why it fits with this research question. I like the practicality of this approach in giving me something that I could really use to then help do some practical things beyond it as well, rather than just describe. So I think the orthodoxy, in some senses, I think is always questioned anyway within the field. You know, the orthodoxy of this particular approach has quite a number of articles written that, you know, critique whether it's, you know, its own validity and such. And I think there's a new edition of the main text around it, which I'm looking forward, it's just out, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they're saying about some of those critiques. But I thought, if I'm going in as deep as I'm going, I'm trying my best to kind of, you know, be committed to the different aspects of this particular approach. That's all I can do. Now, I think there were still some creative aspects to what I did, because I think what was creative about my work was how I managed to make sense of the level of data that I had and represent the complexity of people's lived experience through using some visual methods. So that was really helpful for me, and I think I managed to get quite a lot of creativity into that because of the richness and the depth of the data that I had, and I wanted to then do justice to that. So I think you can use a lot of creativity in anything, whichever approach you choose. But it comes down to, I think, to the detail, and always being able to articulate why you think the detail of your research matters. And I think, you know, I did another discussion, I was speaking to other people about this recently. I think every detail of your research study matters, because actually if you don't attend to the detail at all the different stages of what you're doing with the methods, you're not going to get the kind of data you need. So you can't then answer the question that you've set out to do. You might not answer your question anyway, but you've no chance of answering the question if you've not designed everything to the detail. So I think I was really, really careful in the detail of different bits of the design to be able to then, and then I was, you know, all the different parts of things about how I would then analyse the detail of how I would then do that. So yeah, I think the detail matters, staying on track matters, and if you go off track, I think it's really important to come back. I found it really important to come back to, okay, let's look at this, how it's suggested that this methodology and these methods should work. Have I attended to that? Where have I gone off? And if I've gone off track, why was that? You know, and if that didn't fit, why did that not fit, and what else am I using to bring some thinking into this? So yeah, as you can hear how complicated it is through how almost confusing it might sound. I think there's a lot to it, and I think that comes back to that point that I made earlier about, I think you can do something like this well, and I'm not saying in any way that mine is a really good example at all, but I like what I've done. I'm still quite happy with, I'm still kind of quite in love with the way I've done it, because it did fit for me, it did fit with my question, and I really found out a lot. So from that point of view, it worked for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it absolutely does. And I think, you know, we know with any methodology, it's always contested. There are always different choices that you have to make. And as you said, as long as you're conscious of the kinds of choices that you're making and why you're making them, and that you can demonstrate that, then you're on pretty secure ground. You've also hinted at an answer to this question, but I wonder if you could elaborate. Did you consider any other methodologies where you veer in different directions, and what made you settle on IPA as opposed to a closely aligned area?
Yeah, this is a nicer, no, it's not nicer, but it's a different version of the Viva getting these questions actually. The Viva was lovely, it was very friendly, so I don't want to say anything other than that. I think that originally when I was setting out to do the programme, I was absolutely heart set on doing an action research project, because I wanted to have the power, you know, of the participants really, really visible in, you know, generating knowledge, using knowledge, and doing that very much in collaboration. But that was not to be when I kind of got to this sense of wanting to go back to, I want to really look at the nature of learning, what learning even is in the context of social workers in the course of their work. rather than, you know, where I'd originally wanted to do this thing about improving that. And I thought, how can I improve something that I don't understand? And I think that we can really miss some bits around. So that had to go, and that was very uncomfortable to let that go when I was really quite hard set on doing something around that. The other reason I was needed to shift from that was I felt that in the organisation that was the site of my research, I felt that there could be expectations around almost that might bias what would be done or what would be chosen as a focus in terms of improving, which was a really big issue for my research anyway, that I was looking at learning in itself, in its essence, rather than the improvement of something that's a big policy agenda or something that's somebody else's agenda anyway. So action research had to go. And then I got really, really interested in phenomenology because I'd always been quite interested in existential philosophy, and I had never really connected everything together. So I had a really, you know, there's so much learning for me about all of that coming together that I had to really reflect on. And then I felt that I had this huge risk of going down a rabbit hole with all of this philosophical stuff that I really, really liked, and some people absolutely hate. So some people might be listening to this that they think, what a lot of nonsense. But actually, you know, some people really don't like it at all. I liked it a bit too much. So I felt that in the end, the IPA gave me something that did give me a bit of a structure to keep me out of going down that rabbit hole, and not just give me the description, but give me that bit of stuff that would be the sense making. I could bring myself into that because there is a huge part of IPA that is using the researcher sense making element within the analysis. So I felt it gave me everything together to give me something that ultimately would be something quite practical, even though I could go down the rabbit hole a little bit, but I wouldn't be completely lost down there. So, you know, so that's why I kind of came full circle really to being a good fit, if that makes sense. So, you know, they're the main things. I did think about grounded theory too, but I thought actually, you know, this is about lived experience, so therefore it has to be phenomenology, you know. And then then I had to then just select, okay, so what am I going to do here?
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. I do want to ask one question, and you can ignore it if you want to. But you've made a connection between phenomenology and existential philosophy. So I just want you, if you can, to give me a sentence where you just draw that line a little bit more harshly for me, a bit more clearly for me.
Well, I think the way that I would simply describe it the most, because I don't get invited to very many parties if I start talking about all this sort of stuff, I think it's really about the nature of this back to the structure and texture of human experience and what it is like to live in this world, or, you know, to live that experience of living in the world and the absolute detail of that. And I think that is really how I would say things connect. You know, that's the most simple way that I could say that the ideas connect. But, you know, the approaches are rooted in philosophical traditions. You know, phenomenology is all kind of rooted in, you know, lots of different parts of philosophical traditions. So it's just, yeah, but I like this bit about, you know, that you know, what is that nature of what it is like to live in this world. Ideas from, I was really into stuff when I was young. That's not one sentence, so I'll stop now. I won't start talking about Jean-Paul Sartre and all these people.
Well, that's really helpful. That makes it much clearer. And of course, at this point, I'd like to ask you to recommend your favourite texts around methodology that really shape your approach, and I'll add them as references to this video. So what are they?
Well, I did read lots of different things, and I know that always takes you away from other stuff, but I thought, you know, you need to read what you need to read to do justice. So, I mean, the go-to text for any IPA is this one, which you can probably see. So it's Smith and Flower's text on IPA, and this is the second edition that's just come out, and it's pretty much a handbook for using IPA. I don't know what they're saying in the second edition because I've just got it, but my first edition is scribbled all over. I always write on my books, so I love that one. But in terms of that depth of phenomenological stuff that I was really wanting, I loved this book from a man called Mark Vagel, which is called Crafting phenomenological research, because I did see my work very much. I loved when I was reading about this idea of crafting research, and I think you could obviously apply that to any approach, because it was very, you know, it kind of was a process that really built, and to craft it well, you did have to attend to these details, and he gives a lot of good example around this detail, so I really like that book too. And I mentioned, I think, when I was discussing things earlier around Max van Meenen's work around lived experience and the structure and texture of life, you know, as we live it. And so I like this one too, very much, research and lived experience. So the second two of those are not IPA specific, but they really helped me get that detail in the phenomenological part of IPA. That was really important to me to do justice to that. So they're my favourites for now around IPA.
Okay, well, Dr. Ferguson, that is very much appreciated. Thank you very much.